Hopefully everybody can see the shared screen okay. Welcome everyone to the latest Q community update with a decent amount to get through today, so we'll move at some pace. A number of things to talk through from releases, evaluator, Q use in other languages, modules in the central registry, encodings, qlang.org, qplease, lsplease, and the file embedding proposal, which is sort of an additional item on the agenda for today. So we'll get straight into it. It's been just under 2 months since our last call. We are aiming to have a monthly cadence on these calls. At the end of June, we had a little offsite, long offsite actually, which is what caused us to skip a session. And there's also been a number of folks away on holiday in the time since as well. So hence we've ended up on a 2-month gap from last time. Just a quick reminder, we use GitHub projects. There's 2 forms of GitHub projects we use to update on releases and plan for release cycles, as well as the roadmap projects, which should really capture the main areas of focus for the Q project. They're linked from the slide here, and again, we'll make the slides available after this call as well. So without further ado, let me move on to Daniel and release updates.
So we've done quite a few releases since the last time we had one of these calls. So we did finish the 0.9 release cycle with the stable release. And following that, 2 bug fix releases from what I recall, mostly module stuff, but nothing too concerning. And then we've begun the cycle for 0.10. We did the first alpha nearly 2 weeks ago. It included the first implementation of the embed experiment proposal, which has been on GitHub for some time, as well as many other enhancements. The second alpha came out just yesterday with a first implementation for an ignore file attribute and many other fixes. And then the rough plan is an alpha 3 likely next week, and then probably no more alphas and final release around middle of August. But that depends, of course, on how well things go, particularly with people reporting regressions and so on.
Yep, and looking to time that release as well to coincide or to quickly follow the Go 123 release, which then just allows us to somewhat align our Go versions as well. Perfect, thank you very much. We'll skip straight on, if that's okay, to the evaluator and Marcel.
Do I have controls of the slides, or I call?
Yeah, you should do. As in, if you look at the shared screen, I think you should have control of the slides from there.
I don't think so, actually.
Okay, while somebody fixes that, you can shout out to me next slide. You should be able to do that in a second.
Okay, since the last update, there's basically 2 tracks we've been following for the new evaluator. So one of it is, so as you know, since the last time we enabled a new evaluator through an experiment flag, like a environment variable. So one of the focuses was more bug fixes. And the other one was to implement the API on top of the new evaluator. So the API basically abstracts away from the evaluator implementation, but it also means it's the implementation of the API is very implementation specific. So it had to be redone from scratch. So let me see now if I can go to the next slide. No, so I still have no controls. So next slide. Yeah. So rather than focusing more on the bug fixes, so actually so some people wanted to test the new evaluator. They say we really want to test it with the new API. So the focus shifted a little bit as implementing it for the new API, which is just as important or also really necessary to be able to release it. So it's just a reprioritization within the new evaluator. So that has been, so I would say the API now has less bugs that are specific to the API than the evaluator itself. So that actually overshoots the new evaluator implementation. So you can enable it. It still needs to be explicitly enabled. You can do that through the new, to the QContext new call. So there's an evaluator version option now where you can pass eval v3 or experiment, depends on how you want it to evolve. Always latest or fixed to v3. And then also our development is going to be focused on bug fixing for this structure sharing solution. So structure sharing has proved to be giving an enormous performance boost beyond what the new evaluator already does. It is, though, something very new and something the API wasn't used to. So you have to think about Q, not for the user so much, but for the implementation, you have to think about it a bit differently. So this did introduce some bugs, but the benefits are so incredibly great, as it turns out, that we focus on doing everything with structure sharing enabled by default. But if you run into a weird bug, you can turn it off with either the command with the environment variable q_debug. Sharing equals false, or in the queue context, you can also disable it if you run into issues there. But it might be that we run into bugs that only occur when sharing is disabled, because that happens too. And those we don't prioritize fixing, really, because nobody really should be running ultimately with sharing disabled. It's nice, we use it to learn and all stuff, but it's not that important. Next slide.
Just before we go to the next slide, a huge thank you to those people who have created tools using the Go API and who are already trying out the new evaluator and reporting bugs against it. Whether you're reporting bugs using the Go API or just using Command Q and the new evaluator, that's a huge help. Thanks for those who are helping to kick the tires on it early, because it's helping to flush out issues. We're adding regression tests. We're finding a number of things, old bugs that are fixed by the new evaluator, which we're also adding a regression test for to make sure the new evaluator doesn't regress. And as a result, we're closing out old bugs as well. But thank you to those who are helping to dig in and get started on all this.
Yeah, and all the old and new evaluator are tested in parallel, and where they deviate, we keep both test results there with an explanation why they deviate and whether it needs to be fixed or not. And the idea is that then ultimately it will converge again. So there's a whole tooling suite to keep these two in sync where it makes sense. So so for API and tools, so as said, most of the issues are fixed. So tools flow, for example, was last time, it still had quite a few bugs. It's now no known bugs left. There are some left in the evaluator and in export. I mean, it's really just a few, like some closeness at the top level where it's really not the evaluator, but it's the API that has some special handling, which is not always entirely correct right now, but it's with a new evaluator, but it's getting there. The one thing that really doesn't work yet with the new evaluator at all is Trim, because Trim was basically built not on the abstraction layer, but on the low-level data structures of the evaluator, which are completely different for the new and old evaluator. Considering that Trim also had quite a few bugs, we now have started an effort, and I'll get back to that in a minute, started an effort to redo Trim from scratch. Like there was some functionality that people wanted where they thought, like, why doesn't Trim do this? And it's like, yeah, it kind of makes sense. We maybe should allow Trim to do this and basically get a bit more principled of what Trim should do, and then re-implement it from scratch. So Trim is actually, it's complicated, but it's not a very big implementation, right? It's like 100 lines of 200 lines of code or something like that. So we can, it's not the worst to do that from scratch. And then, so the new evaluator also is much more precise with subsumption and some other things. So that also should allow us to make Trim potentially a lot better than it is right now. So for the evaluator, we have about 96% of the issues fixed. So for those that have a good memory, that is not much more than we had fixed last time. There's a few reasons for that. So part of it is because a lot of work has gone into the API development, and there are a lot, so that's not counted in this 96%, but that was a lot of bugs that were fixed there. Part of it is because I had like a few days distraction with the embed proposal. Then we had an offsite, vacation, and another offsite, which I come back in 20 seconds now. And also the remaining bugs seem to be very all related, even though they don't seem to be related, seem to be related to structural cycle detection. And what it turns out is that it looks like, it feels like we can fix all of these bugs by greatly simplifying the structural cycle detection and stripping out much of the code. So this is right now a theory, but it seems worth investigating it, because it will make things, again, a lot simpler, a lot faster, and a lot more robust, actually. So it's a new idea for structural cycle detection. So it seems worth an investigation, but it also costs a week so far. And so far, it actually does fix a lot of bugs, but it's not been checked in yet. Next cycle. So then the thing I was saying, I was alluding to, coming back in 1 minute and 20 seconds, is this. So the latest offsite, I was speeding up Matthew Segman, which is a new helping hand. He's gonna first focus on trim, basically, so the redesign and re-implementation of trim, and that seems to be a really good project to really understand how the evaluator works from a low-level point of view, right? So the idea is that in the long run, also he is going to work on the evaluator, so that we have more people working on that, and that's if I get hit by a bus or whatever, right? Like the work doesn't stop also. So that's helpful. Yeah, well, yeah, until we can cloning is great, but that's, there's some leeway time, right? And actually, anyway, so yeah, so those are some of the reasons why this 96% is not that much further. So another reason is also that some of the levels of bugs, so like some of them before were we can't run it at all, and then they became P0 bugs, and some of them are now P1 bugs. So we don't distinguish between that, right? But also the severity of the bugs has actually reduced. We have no bugs left anymore that we skip, right? Like all bugs are executed right now. So that's also a big improvement, but it hasn't actually improved to 96% percentage point. So that is it from, or is there a next slide? Yes, there is a next slide. Yeah, so for the next things to do, so the remaining issues is to fix this cycle, or to proceed on the cycle detection thing. So there's a few bugs that might be related to that as well, actually, but that also, so API specific things that are open. And the aim is then to get it into a stable enough position that we will flip it on by default. So this will not fix certain things, but the idea is that it's so for example, some error messages will improve, but some error messages will become worse. So this will be a next thing to fix, but the idea is that performance, stability, and sort of correctness is more important than the error messages. So you still will be able to go back to the old evaluator, but it would be worth it enabling it by default. So that's one thing. So it also will not include yet so the old evaluator has like this lifetime management of objects and sort of buffers, and make sure prevents a lot of allocations. So the new evaluator, even though it doesn't do that at all, we completely turn it off. It still seems that even in the worst cases, the memory usage is on par with the old evaluator, right? We expected it to be much worse, the memory usage, but it's not, right? So it seems like it's useful to enable it, even though we haven't fixed that yet, right? Because it's already performing better than the old evaluator there. So that means that even if we can reuse an object, we still reallocate at the moment, but it doesn't seem to affect performance that much. Then we will be working on improving error messages. Also, the new evaluator allows disjunctions to be made linear. We haven't done that at all yet, so that's another focus. So that should also improve performance still a lot. But as I said, right now it's already so much faster that it's still worth releasing it without that. Then there is one performance bug compared to the old evaluator. And even there, the memory usage seems to be equal with the old and new evaluator. But one performance bug which has to is related to the chaining of references. So if you reference something that reference something that reference something, so that right now is polynomial. So we have for the old evaluator, we did have a fix for that, but which introduced too many regressions. So the idea is that we will take that fix, but then port it to the new evaluator and release that. And we know that that is also like a significant performance boost. So we see that for some configurations that have this particular problem, they don't benefit much from the new evaluator or at all. But we are aware that of a solution for this problem that we know will fix things considerably. So that would be that's a relatively low-hanging fruit that we will be working on, but only after we flip it to the default, basically. So it seems to be but even with these performance problems, the old and new evaluator are on par. And that then really is it for me.
Great, thank you very much. We'll move quickly on to Q with, oh, hang on, if I hit the slides, then we will. Q with other languages, and Aram, please.
Thank you, Paul. So Q, as you well know, is written in Go, but which means currently, if you want to use like from an API point of view, you can only use it in Go. We want to expand this to other languages, as we talked before. Basically, the update since the previous call. So we have libq, which is a low-level binding for C-like languages. It's not really documented. The only binding that we had was the Java API, although it wasn't really well documented either, but it was supposed to be usable. Since then, we have worked and added a Python binding, which is roughly at the same API level as the Java one. But all of this is still experimental, and lots of APIs are still missing. In particular, the things that are coming next will be support for iterators. That's missing from both Java and Python. So that will come next, along, of course, with documentation.
Super, thanks. Chatting to Rawcode yesterday, he's already threatened to start using libq in order to get something working with Rust. So that people are interested even in playing with libq itself in order to just start poking with other languages as well. Thanks, Aram. Rog, can I hand over to you for modules, please?
Yeah. So we're working from a different slide, so I had actually edited these slides slightly in progress because I was actually had been looking at the wrong update call so I actually have some things in here which I mentioned in the previous update call too. So I'll kind of skip over those. So which I only realized at the start of this call. So there have been some changes to module.q, but less than I will talk about. Support for transition from legacy module files, Q mod fix, that I think already existed at the time of the last module call, and some other changes that I'll mention. Next slide, please. So as we mentioned before, module.q is parsed according to the language version field, and we've actually got a document for that now, which describes how the language version affects the way that Q is used by Q in terms of interpreting old versions as if you were actually running those old versions of the evaluator. And we're parsing it in data-only mode. I think that was also the case before. We're actually now allow any module with a path that doesn't have a major version suffix. It's just implied to be v0. This is really good for actually transition. It makes the transition between old style and new style much easier. And also it's probably convenient because most people will start off with v0. So I think that seems useful. The qmod edit, you can now edit the language version field and other fields. And similarly, when you use qmod init to create a new module file, you can specify the source and language version. And if you just say qmod init, you'll get a default module name, which is a fake name, but at least allows the module file to be valid, and you can import things. But you clearly won't be able to publish that or do it or use it in any other place apart from local. So that name is q.example. The custom field, I think, actually was around at the time of the last update call. So as was qmod fix. but go back one
Oh,
thing.
sorry.
There's I think that the accept legacy modules flag in qload is new. So that means that if you don't have the freedom to run qmodfix to fix things at the source level, you can actually still run qload and allow legacy module files even in the present, even when even using the new some of the new semantics. So that's useful when you can't fix upstream. Next slide, please. And I think none also was present at the time of the last update call. There are a few other enhancements we've explicitly documented, like so. You can say package underscore, and that's equivalent to having no package clause, which is useful when if you want, for example, file level attributes and you don't have a package clause. There's a new @ignore attribute, which is equivalent if you use go to go build ignore. And basically says ignore this file for dependency purposes, for all other purposes, and just ignore it regardless. And that's sort of similar to build tags, but it's just say ignore in all cases. We've got some better documentation of import paths, and we've got better caching in module dependencies in the module dependency code. So when you have packages that are shared across multiple directories, it was possible to have those parent packages read multiple times, doing lots of file reads, and that now all the caching of that shared across all the load code. So that's actually so if you have packages shared in a lot in that like that, then that really can speed things up. And also this was a regression in the new modules code, is that we didn't allow symbolic links. We gave an error when you have symbolic links, and now we explicitly said that we support them but only locally, and that helps. I think Steve Harris was particularly useful in reporting some of these issues, because working with Bazel, it actually creates packages based on symlinks, and that stopped working, and now it should work. But we don't. If you publish a module, the symbolic links are not preserved, or they're just dropped silently, which actually mirrors Go's behavior, and that's because there's no easy portable way to represent symbolic links across platforms. I think that might be it, apart from the fact that a reminder that we do have the central registry. It's live, you can use it. It uses GitHub for authentication and also for authorization, so you can actually have modules that are private to you or to a selection of people. And yeah, modules are all limited to github.com for now, but that won't be the case for very long. And you will need an invite via the modules channels, but we're shortly to be removing that invite requirement, and we're also planning to populate the central registry with some curated modules for well-known schemas and services, and also we're working on creating content on using the central registry, of which there already is some content on the on qlang.org, I believe.
Yep.
So I think that's probably it as regards to modules.
Thanks, Rog. Daniel on encodings.
Yep. So there are multiple fronts that are active right now with encodings. One of them I haven't talked about for a while. In 0.9, we shipped a new YAML decoder. For some brief context, this uses Go YAML v3 instead of our old fork of an older Go YAML version. And that shipped as a default experiment in 0.9 and still in master in 0.10. There have been no apparent bug reports or regressions on GitHub or on Slack or Discord, which is partly surprising, but also really good news. So assuming that this continues to be the case, in 0.11, we'll remove the old decoder, because two release cycles, roughly 6 months, should be long enough for people to have time to test this stuff and report bugs. So please test either the latest alpha or 0.9 with your projects. If you do decode or import a lot of YAML, especially with comments or funky syntax, and please say if anything breaks, because this is the last month or so to do that. Next slide, please. I'm also making good progress on the TOML encoding. The decoder is merged and feature complete. There are some minor to-dos left, for example, with performance, but it does work from what I can tell. The encoder will be finished this week. It's going to be fairly basic to start with, so no support for comments, and the syntax will be fairly verbose. That is because the library we're using, GoTOML, does not support encoding TOML syntax. It only supports encoding Go values as TOML. The reason we chose this library is because it does have a syntax decoder. All other TOML libraries only decode into Go values, which is not useful to us. So the next steps for this is to finish the encoder and then wire up both the encoder and decoder into Command Q and ship in 0.10. And like I mentioned, it's going to be fairly rough, especially on the encoding side, on the encoder side initially, but it should work. And then we can get some early testing in place. And finally, I just want to say thanks to David, Austin, Joshua, and Krishnan, and some others, because they've been having some interesting discussions on Slack in terms of generating Go and protobuf types from Q definitions. It seems like some people already have some experiments that sort of work. So tentatively, I've set up a call to have some demos and coordinate on next steps next week. Next Thursday at the same time as this call, 3 p.m. UTC. And it is also in the community calendar. So anybody's free to join, but we will also record it if anybody's not able to join. And as a reminder, we also have the encodings channel on both Slack and Discord, if anybody wants to follow up asynchronously.
Great, thank you very much. I'll move on and talk about qlang.org. Thanks very much to Jonathan Matthews for all his work on qlang.org and also for help pulling together this update as well. There's a number of new how-to guides that include here fetching JSON data over HTTP, for example, giving a demo there of how a Q command workflows can be used to effectively do non-hermetic things. Some work there on conditionally including Q files using build attributes, and that'll also become relevant, as Rog said, when it comes in the modules where we've made some tweaks there, and we'll need to refine that documentation a bit as well. Common one, negating a disjunction. Thanks to Hans for helping to contribute that piece there. It's been referenced already. We've been working on an embedding files proposal. There's some experimental documentation on that as well. And conditionally including elements in a list. These are all fairly common questions that get asked with some regularity. And we're now fairly well rehearsed on actually getting questions in Slack and then spinning up a piece of documentation in fairly short order and getting it published. So thanks to Jonathan helping to drive that forward. Here's a quick screenshot of the embed piece of documentation. You can go on, click on, make sure you're using the correct version of Q. You can see we're currently depending on Alpha 2, and then the embed proposal will work for you locally as well. We'll talk a bit more about the embed proposal later on. For those people working with the Go API, Marcel said that there's been a lot of work on the evaluator as far as the Go API is concerned for eval v3. We're actually starting to add a few more demos of the use of the Go API to the qlang.org site, in particular, for example, how to use errors or handle errors via the Go API. Thanks to Tony, a number of people rely on Tony's qtutorials.com for a lot of this documentation. So it's good to be learning what kind of things people are depending on out there, and then working to get these sort of refined examples into the qlang.org site. So a hat tip there to Tony, again, for qtutorials, because that is still something that a lot of people end up referring to when they say, can somebody explain or can talk about this a bit more? And here is the handling errors Go API, a screenshot of that there. So new concept guides, Roger already talked about this, an explanation of how language versions are handled by Q when we're coming to load Q code, what the module specifies is the language version, what's allowed, what's not allowed, etc. And we've also translated what was a wiki before into a page on qlang.org now, which is a sort of like an FAQ / compare and contrast of new modules versus old modules. So rather than just have it be a wiki, which we spun up really to just in the interest of expediency, we now have it on qlang.org, so it's searchable, etc. Any questions that folks are running into? What we're doing is we're quickly adding to that FAQ, just so that there's a one-stop shop we can point people to as they're making the transition. And there is the Q language versions piece of documentation looking resplendent as a new concept guide. A number of things that are fixed since last time. A better installation guide for folks who are landing on Q for the first time. The Q Playground is fixed to be more mobile friendly. That was a huge problem for a number of people. It just wasn't working at all. And there was a bug quite recently where for some reason people clicking on a pre-existing example in the playground weren't able to actually get it to load. All of these things have been fixed. So apologies for those irritating bugs along the way. They should all be now fixed, and the playground should be back up to its usual self. And we also have convenience links of one we've added to the new Discord server we've created. More on that a bit later on. And there is said installation guide as well, refined. Q search results are, search results on qlang.org are also improved as well. We've made a couple of tweaks to the Algolia indexing and the sort of slightly more advanced syntax if, for example, you want to use quoted forms of search terms. So that, I think, is it on qlang.org side of things. So thanks again to Jonathan for all his work on that, especially on refining some documentation to actually make it more accessible to folks. It's a huge win to have more accessible language and easier things to understand when it comes to any Q documentation. So it's greatly appreciated. On the Q Please side of things, Marcel's already sort of explained that it's been a busy couple of months since last time. And so this update is unfortunately similar to last time, but I have a commitment to you on the next slide. There has, however, been further progress on go-to-definition, hover, and error diagnostics. They're the things we're focusing on. And when it comes to AST healing that we'll need to do in order to have the LSP working in like real-life scenarios. For example, as you're halfway through editing a file, you might actually be in a situation where the AST is broken and you don't want QPlease to fall over entirely at that point. GoPlease has a similar sort of problem and similar sorts of solution, and that's what the AST healing piece does. In that respect, we're going to feed that into the editor agnostic integration tests we have, so we will be able to test sort of people midway through editing rather than requiring them to be at a good syntax representation. So the commitment is that changes will be landing in 0.10 and 0.11 for QPlease and the LSP. I'll try that again. Changes will be landing in 0.10 and 0.11 for QPlease, i.e. the LSP, working with VS Code and NeoVim. So yes, it has been a quiet couple of months on that in that respect, but we are going to get these changes landed in 0.10 and 0.11. The release cycle for QPlease is effectively different, or it's not tied, I should say, to Q itself. It is bundled with Q, but we don't sort of have to abide by the same, use the phrase lightly, stability guarantee. So we will just be able to keep releasing stuff with every version of Q. At some point, we will fold it into the Q command itself, but we're not ready to do that yet. So we'll just be able to be a touch more aggressive on making changes in QPlease. And the integration test will be the thing that we're relying on there from is everything working perspective. It's been mentioned a number of times now, just to briefly reference the file embedding proposal. We've had a significant amount of interest in the proposal. Thank you to everyone who's given it a try, provided feedback, etc. This has been a very long awaited proposal, for want of a better phrase. So thanks to everyone for their patience, first of all, but also then for getting stuck in and actually giving this a try. So the proposal is all about directly loading files of any type as part of a Q evaluation. It's linked there as discussion 3264, and that discussion links to the actual proposal detail itself. A bit of an explanation about the experimental implementation that Daniel talked about having been released as part of 0.10 Alpha 1, and a link to the docs that actually demonstrate how file embedding works. But just give a quick immediate tease of how things work here. Top left here, you can see example.q that uses the extern attribute to enable embedding within that file. And within that file, we just have a single field called onefile, which embeds a file called readme.md. And there we specify the type explicitly to say that this is a text file. There you can see just below it, bottom left, the readme.md file, which just says hello world. Then over on the right-hand side, you can see how we're enabling the experiment by the QExperiment environment variable, and then just running QExport. And that then is the result. What we're doing is we're effectively loading that file, and according to the type, then creating like a syntactic Q representation of what has then been loaded and decoded from the file according to that file type. So we don't just just have support for single files. We also have support for multiple files, and that comes in the form of globs. And here you can see what we're doing is we are embedding all JSON files in the current directory as well. So star.json, and the proposal links to an explanation of the glob syntax that we're using is consistent with the rest of the standard library. So here we got 3 JSON files, as you can see them below the Q file. And then the result on the right-hand side, which I've just chosen to render as YAML in this situation, shows how those 3, according to the JSON encoding type here, are rendered on QExport. And note, in this situation, we didn't actually have to specify the type because we fully specified the extension of the files that we were importing. That's a known file extension. And so in that situation, we're able to automatically decode what files it is that we're seeking to be embedded. You can see as well, although actually in YAML, it's perhaps not quite so clear, that the many fields file is a map from the string file path to the contents of that file. Perhaps it would have been actually easier for me to have rendered this as Q or indeed as JSON, but hopefully that becomes clear. So whatever the path, the full file path, including directories, is included as the key, and then the value is effectively the contents of the file, excuse me, is the value that maps to. There's a number of open questions and next steps. The discussion in 3264 has been fantastic. Thank you to everyone for contributing. I've summarized what some of those open questions and next steps are here. I'll just call out a couple, but please do click through to the discussion itself for more information. One of the more critical ones or most requested ones is support for star and glob patterns to allow effectively recursively including, recursive in quotes, recursively including directories, fallback file type support. Do we have the naming correct with @embeds? Perhaps we need to refine what we're referring to when we say embedding, because Q, of course, already has value embedding. Maybe we need to distinguish this by calling it file embedding, just so that we're clear in what we're talking about. So anyone who's willing to give this a try, please do. Please also give us feedback. Whatever that feedback might be, you might consider or think to yourself, oh, this won't be particularly useful in terms of feedback. I can guarantee you it is, because effectively your immediate knee-jerk reactions to things are actually incredibly good when it comes to, have we got the documentation right? Are we explaining it sensibly, etc.? So getting all this right now. We'll continue. We haven't yet finalized when we're going to shift this out of an experiment. It certainly won't be for 0.10 itself. We'll keep it as experimental for one release cycle, I would imagine. But fingers crossed, if we can nail down these open questions and next steps, that actually for 0.11, we can shift it out of being experimental, at which point names of attributes, etc., will be slightly more set in stone. So early feedback, good on all of this. I think that's it on that side. So quickly on to community updates, and Dominic.
Sure. Yeah, you might have noticed that there are currently a little bit less community update calls than before. I think this is mainly due that we prioritize written updates, especially on GitHub, but also on Slack. And thus far, this has been very well received. I think on the community side, there's one big change from last time is the introduction of a Discord server. This is basically due to the fact that Discord offers certain advantages, and one of the biggest ones is like the history of all the previous discussions. And this is one of the reasons Discord is used by a lot of open source projects right now, and now also by Q. That doesn't mean that we'll stop using Slack, but we just want to offer this additional venue, and thus far also has been very well received. So if you're not yet on the Discord server, give it a shot. And then, yeah, as Paul already said, we always appreciate hearing feedback. Again, this is a call to action. If you use Q, we don't know you yet. We don't know your use case. Please reach out. Let us know how you're working with Q. What are your use cases? What are your main pain points, or what ideas you have? Because that is very valuable in all future endeavors and helps us a lot. And also, if you don't want to share with us or you have something to share with the wider community, there are various outlets. Please share. I think it is a good sign of a healthy ecosystem. And yeah, just share what you're doing. If you don't know where, you can also reach out. We definitely find a spot. Or if you are a little bit unsure how to share your use case, you can also reach out, and we're happy to help you.
Yep, just on that, there's two things. For example, the encodings call that Daniel's setting up to talk about how Q can be encoded is Go protocol buffers. These are efforts that are happening that we now know about by folks sharing it. That was actually via Slack. That's a good example. And with one user, companies sharing with us how they're using JSON schema, for example, highlighting some problems to us that they're having with JSON schema. It's just a different channel from our perspective as to how we learn about some of these problems in the first case, but also the way in which people are using, in that situation, JSON schema to do validation. That's actually now helping to feed into, for example, the curated modules that we're going to publish in the central registry, and not a number of which are going to be JSON schema based. So it's a really nice virtuous circle to make sort of all this stuff work. It's just to say that we're happy to get on a call and chat rather than just doing everything via the GitHub issues. So I think we've actually done pretty well on timing, and we are now at Q&A. So I will stop presenting now. And if anybody has any questions, happy to take them.
There was one question from Tony, probably.
Oh, okay.
In the chat.
Oh, Marcel, that's probably one. Is that the first question? Does the new structural cycle detection open the possibility for bounded recursion? Marcel might need to come off mute in order to answer that.
Off the mute, yeah, and I realize, yeah. I mean, in principle, it doesn't really change much, except that it doesn't need a lot of the data structures that are used now for the cycle detections. For bounded recursion, yeah. So I mean, Q already supports recursion, right? So I don't know exactly what your use case is, Tony. We deliberately limit the recursion. So I'm wondering what the use cases you have in mind here, Tony.
Yeah, I've got some functions. I think people talked about it before. For like diff patch, or where you want to mask something out and you want to essentially walk Q value recursively and apply some mask to it. Or
yeah, that's what I thought you meant by that. Yeah. So one thought I had recently is that so we've been been a bit delayed with. So the idea is always that you separate Q from from any code, right? Like to not mix code with configurations. And one path we had there was to go the WASM route, so you could implement some things there. So we're investigating different avenues, but one of the possible avenue. So this is the only way I think where we would allow this in Q, right? One possible avenue would be to have Q be one of those languages, right? Where you basically say, okay, you have to put it in a separate file and mark it as a function, but then we just disable the recursion checking for these cases, right? But that you sort of separate it out from your normal configuration, but still not sure if that's a good idea necessarily, but we do want to have a solution that you can really compute within Q, right? Like that's sorely needed, basically. So we aim to find some solution at least.
Yeah, I guess maybe like in terms of WASM, if I had Go and the Q API or SDK and API and whatnot, if you can pass incomplete values across that boundary,
Yeah.
each direction, I think that would probably suffice.
Yeah.
For my use cases.
Yeah, Daniel had some ideas there, and we're investigating that also in parallel.
The critical part of what you said there, Tony, was if you can pass incomplete values, that's effectively what makes that the hardest of all. But yeah, it's not to say it's invalid.
To Go SDK, so there's at
Yeah,
least that one seems maybe tractable.
Yeah,
near term.
Absolutely, and we're investigating that for sure.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want to steal thunder from a future update on that one.
Yeah.
So, Rog?
I would just say that, yeah, as Paul says, walking incomplete data is really hard, right? And so if you've got a comprehension in there and it's incomplete, what's your recursion actually going to do? So walking concrete data is fine. Walking non-concrete data, I think I'm not sure it's ever really going to be a viable possibility apart, in terms of the queue, value walking model. I think that may be a tough ask, and if you really need that, it'd be interesting to know your requirements and what kind of semantics you might actually want from that, because I don't think that's necessarily clear.
Yeah, that's actually
I'm
a good
walking
point.
a limited subset of incomplete queue, mostly where you have a leaf value that's a basic type.
Yeah, I mean that's so there's a slippery slope, a
Wide spectrum.
A wide spectrum of possibilities. That's a good.
Yeah,
better way of putting it.
disjunctions doesn't sound fun.
Yeah, exactly. Well, walking disjunctions, walking comprehensions. There's a load of stuff there, which and currently you can't walk, for example, private fields, and that's maybe a good thing, right? So,
I think it'll be interesting to as our investigation continues on that side, because we are aware that the WASM, there is a WASM hole there. And so as we continue with our investigations, Tony, it would be good to just touch base again and just refine, if, as you say, there are limited subsets of effectively what's required there, to sort of nail down a bit more the detail in that space. So that would be good. Anybody else?
Maybe I missed it. Is there a VS Code plugin yet for Go Please?
For Go Please, yes. For Q Please, not yet. I'm pulling your leg, Tony.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's fine.
No, that's what I am working on. I do need to move the VS Code plugin to the Qlang organization, and then the way it will work is that there'll only be one subtle update to that plugin when it comes to making it work with QPlease. That will be to probably have it be enabled, the use of QPlease be enabled by like an experiment variable or similar to start with. And then it will just look for QPlease in the path, and if it finds it, it'll spin it up and run it as just like a regular language server within VS Code. And so then the same would be true with NeoVim, but it'll work in a similar kind of way. That needs a slightly different sort of configuration within the standard NeoVim language server configurations. But then both will just pick up QPlease from the path. So there won't be anything clever to start with in terms of sharing QPlease instances, although QPlease will be ready to do that from the get-go. And then let's then just assume you have QPlease running within VS Code or NeoVim. The initial functions it will support are formats, go-to-definition, hover, and error diagnostics. That's a pretty good sort of surface area to start with, especially the go-to-definition one, because it will support as well the ability as within Q, because of course there can be multiple sites where something is declared. Quite what that looks like in terms of the VS Code interface to that, I'm not sure, because I've not yet come across a language that has multiple results for a go-to-definition. Certainly within Vim, it'll be possible, for example, NeoVim and Vim, it'll be possible to add all the locations to things like the location list, and then you can use whatever key bindings you have to move from one location to the next. So we'll just have to start exploring what this stuff means in terms of you DX, for want of a better phrase, within VS Code. But as soon as that lands, Tony, as soon as the plugin shifts, and as soon as it's then enabled by the experiment variable, I'll be sharing more details of this pretty aggressively, so
Okay,
folks can just
sounds
give it
good.
a try. If that's it, then we will just thanks everyone for joining. We'll post a recording of the session on the discussion that we had for today, and look for please test the latest, test the latest alpha, and we'll speak to everybody next time.